I came up with the idea of this project series. Done a DNA test. I'll design a dress, picking a different region and point in time. I've been to the Benaki Museum. I remember this one type of costume that really caught my attention. Even then, standing in front of the exhibits, I remember thinking, one day I will make this. Welcome back everyone. In today's video, I will be making a corset and a chemise to go under it as part of my big project series I titled the Amalia costume, where I'm attempting to make a Greek 1840s court gown ensemble. As I arrived to the non-visible part of the costume, the elusive undergarments, it just became that much harder to research what the Greek urban population wore underneath their gowns in the 1840s. It just wasn't a widely discussed topic, and I couldn't find first-hand evidence if they wore a corset underneath their gowns with the Amalia costume. I looked in several books and online publications, and the closest I could come was this, which is a publication I found online at academia.edu, where I found most of my sources. And in there's a quote from a contemporary who lived in Greece, saying that while most of the women who returned to Greece from the diaspora preferred Parisian fashion, the local women retained their traditional dress and wore no corsets. So there are two arguments on this. On one hand, we know that Western fashion dictated everyone to wear corsets. Amalia herself wore the latest Parisian fashion whenever she could, whenever she wasn't attending a public event. So she was definitely not a stranger to the corset. I would even say she would have probably felt undressed without one. On the other hand though, we know that the fashion before the Frankish influence was dictated by the Ottomans, and in the Eastern tradition, bust support was either provided by fitted bodices or it was not required, as they wore very loose kaftans that didn't need any shapewear underneath. And according to this book, we know that the villagers didn't wear corsets either. So, which one is it? As I couldn't be sure either way, I decided I'll do a bit of experimental archaeology, as I will make the stays. And once my whole outfit is ready, I will wear it with and without the stays, and we'll just see which one looks more like the pictures and the portraits. For the stays, I used this 1840s red threaded pattern, which I purchased from their Etsy store. From there, I just had to print it out and assemble the pieces. So I have a couple of these old tablecloths lying around, and I decided to use one of them as the fabric of the stays, because they have this beautiful pattern on it. The only problem is that they are full of holes and stains. I mean, that's why I have them. So as I was cutting out the pieces, I had to be really careful to avoid those. Because this tablecloth is quite lightweight and frail fabric, I thought it wise to strengthen it with a second layer. So I used this thicker cotton and cut out all the pieces again. Once I was done with that, I matched the fashion fabric up with the lining pieces, pinned them together and sewed them around. Then I used the serger to serge all the edges again. And now I was finally ready to start assembling my stays. First, as per the instructions, I stitched around the stitch line on the bust gussets, folded them back and pinned the gussets in. Then using my sewing machine, I carefully sewed them in place. Then I did essentially the same thing to the back hip gusset. Well, that wasn't easy at all. But now that I'm done with it, I'm gonna press all the seams down. And also, I can start to press inwards the edges of the bust pocket and sew the top of it back. To make the eyelets, I used this leather making tool. And for the first time in my life, I tried to make hand-sewn eyelets. The first one was a kind of iffy, but the second one actually looked a lot better. And I had a lot of time to practice, as I also had to hand sew all the eyelets on the back as well. So I'm pretty sure I wasn't supposed to put in the bones yet, but I was a little too eager. Therefore, wherever it was marked, I just sewed along the lines and inserted the bones between the two layers of fabric. Then the last step to assemble the whole stay was to sew the side hip gusset in, joining the front and the back pieces together. Then I marked out the placement of the eyelets, and using the method previously described, I made the holes and bound them all by hand. Then I made the last boning channel by flipping back the side seam and sewing down the edge of it. So most of my corset is done now. I know I want to put some embroidery on it, and I need to figure out what pattern to do and where. I also want to put some cording on it somewhere. To decide it, I think I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna take a picture of my corset on my dummy, and I'm gonna use Photoshop to draw out the patterns and maybe figure out what do I want to do. Now that I knew where I wanted the cording channels to be, I marked the placements of them out and sewn along the markings. To insert the cords, I used a wire I bent to the shape of an oversized blunt needle and a seam ripper to make tiny holes which through I could feed them. It was a long process, as the wire kept getting caught on the fabric as I was pulling it through the channels, but it was still easier than it would have been without its help. I used this light blue bias binding to finish the edges of the stays and to add an accent color to the design. I've sewn them on right sides facing first with a machine, then folded them in and tacked them down by hand. I repeated this process for the top edge and for both of the straps too. Before sewing the top binding down though, I had to sew in a drawstring to the side seams. These strings serve a double purpose. You can adjust the neckline with them by tightening it and also keep the bust in the pocket, as they weave through the eyelets we previously made. To be able to do that though, you have to leave a seam in the center front of your bias binding to be able to pull them through there. To figure out how exactly my embroidery should go, I used the tracing paper to sketch out my ideas, and once I was happy with it, I transferred them onto the fabric. Okay, so this hand embroidery thing is not really working out because it's gonna take forever for me to finish it. So I'm gonna try out something new, something I never tried before. Freehand embroidery with a sewing machine. I don't even know how to do it. but let's give it a try. Okay, so it's not as hard as it seems actually. You just have to remove the foot of your sewing machine and just move the needle where you want your design to go. It takes a little bit of getting used to, for sure, but you can get the hang of it quite quickly. My only constant worry was that I'm gonna sew my fingers to it, but even that fades after a while. And you know what? I liked it even more than the stitching I did by hand. The lines are a lot thinner and that makes the design so much more delicate. So once I was done with the side gusset, I mirrored the design on the other side and embroidered that one too. I also decided to add some embroidery to the back gussets, and I designed and embroidered those flowers the same way as I did these. At this point, I decided the garment needed more of its statement baby blue color, so I redid the eyelets on the straps with a thicker blue thread and the corresponding eyelets on the bodice too. Then I serged the bottom edge of the straps so it won't fray, and I attached them to the back panels. We're at the part where I need to insert the bust. So what I did is I went to a wood shop and I bought 2 meters of this wood. I'm gonna try cut it to size and maybe round the edges down. Let's see what happens. Now that my corset is ready, a second problem came up. Looking at the portraits and the paintings, I can see that their dress bodice is so low cut that they are definitely wearing this chemise over the corset, otherwise it would show. If they are wearing a corset, of course. Meaning that there was probably a second layer of chemise underneath the corset to protect it and the chemise from perspiration. And I have no idea what they could have looked like. So I'm just gonna do the same thing as I did with the corset, and I'm gonna assume that the queen has modeled these after the latest Parisian fashion in the 1840s. And just take a basic Western chemise and make that. Looking at the tutorials and diagrams online, it seems that the chemise doesn't require a lot of patterning to make, as it is basically consists of different sized rectangles and a neckline piece, which is the only part that actually requires some thought. To create the pattern for that, I used my tin tape to mark out the shape I wanted to achieve and transfer the lines onto a scrap fabric. I used this fabric as the pattern to cut out 2 of each piece from an old bed sheet. As I wanted the chemise to have a button up front, the front piece consisted of 2 sides, while the back piece was made as one. I sewed the lining and the main pieces together on the top edges and the center front, where the buttons will be, and turned them inside out and pressed them flat. Then I joined the front and the back pieces at the shoulder seams. To make the sleeves, I cut 2 rectangles of 16 by 6.5 inches and 2 gores that were 4 by 4 inches. Starting at one corner, I joined the gore to the shorter edge of the rectangle, then I joined the immediate next side of the gusset to the other short edge. Then, only things left is to close the rest of that edge, and voila, you have a sleeve. Now, to set the sleeves in, so to speak, I took the top middle point of the sleeve and pinning it to the shoulder seam of the collar piece, I attached 3.5 inches on each side of that point to the fashion fabric, right sides together. I cut 2 33 by 30 inch rectangles to make the front and the back panels and sewed 2 rows of loose stitching for gathering it. I pinned the gathered panels to the neckline, right sides facing together with the main fashion fabric, and sewed them on by machine. I also attached the gores to the side seams and closed those seams up. I flipped the top seams in, and using the lining side of the collar piece, I covered all the raw edges from the inside of the garment by carefully felling it down by hand. I also marked out the middle of the front panel and slashed a little opening into it for a closure later. I created a tiny rolled hem there and tacked it down so it won't fray. I made the buttonholes by machine and attached the mother of pearl buttons to the other side of the collar. As the finishing touches, I hemmed the sleeve by turning it in back twice and tacking it down by hand, and the skirt by ironing the hem into place and using the blind stitch setting on my sewing machine.